welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Barney Levantino, and welcome to another chapter of Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Library. I'm happy to welcome today Don Bentley, author of just released. The title is Target Acquired. It is the newest in the Jack Ryan Jr. series, part of the Tom Clancy universe. Don, welcome. Happy to have you here today.
Thanks so much for having me, Barney. I really appreciate it.
We appreciate your time as well. So tell us a little bit about Jack Ryan Jr., and then tell us as much as you like to about the new entry in the series today.
Sure. So Jack Ryan Jr. is an iconic character as part of the Tom Clancy universe. And he's very interesting for a number of reasons. So he is the son of Jack Ryan Sr. that most readers are probably more familiar with. And in the Clancy universe, in the book universe, Jack Ryan Sr. is now president of the United States. And so he's an older gentleman. Jack Ryan Jr., when friends of mine ask me about it or are confused about the difference between the two, I say that Jack Ryan Jr. is about the same age as Jack Ryan on the Amazon TV series. So about the same age. And you can imagine kind of why that they split those two characters off, because while the Jack Ryan Senior books are still incredibly entertaining and have tons of geopolitical implications and things being done, it's a little hard for Jack Ryan Senior to get out of the White House and kick in doors and punch bad guys in the face. It's not something that's very conducive to his role as president now. And so his son, luckily, is very equipped to step into that role. And Jack Ryan Jr. originally started as a financial analyst for a firm that's an off-the-books intelligence firm, if you will. And then over this series progression, he's moved over into the covert operative side of things. And another thing that makes him an interesting character in this transition is that most thriller protagonists have the background that justifies what they do for a living. So, for instance, his father was a CIA analyst before he jumped into a Russian submarine and helped a Soviet captain defect and all the amazing things and hunt for the Red October. But he was still somebody who was part of the intelligence community and went to, and was a CIA employee. Where his son, on the other hand, was never went to the farm like CIA case officers do. Was never a member of the military. Never did. And so he had to both learn those skills from some very capable, iconic characters like Ding Chavez and John Clark and Mary Pat Foley and things like that. But at the same time, he also had to justify, both maybe in his own mind more than the characters, of why he got to be there. And to be frank, the reason why he got to be there at first is because his last name is Ryan. Right. And so he's very much as a character trying to prove his worth in this atmosphere of iconic characters who have all followed the more traditional things. And so that's what makes this interesting. And so when I got the opportunity to write Target Acquired, what I did is sat down with my editor, who's Tom Colgan, and Tom is also the editor for my series, the Matt Drake thriller series. And so that helped quite a bit when we started to work together. Is that the way I pitched the book to him is like, hey, what if we did a neck down version on just Jack Ryan Jr. himself? And so rather than having a lot of the iconic characters come into play, let's just focus on him. And when my editor, who's also named Tom, so there are too many Toms sometimes in this conversation between Tom Colgan and Tom Clancy, but my editor, Tom Colgan, was talking to me about a Jack Ryan Sr. book he had worked on with Mark Cameron. He said the premise behind the book is Jack Ryan Sr. is president, and with that comes tremendous advantages when he goes to solve a problem. But what if we envisioned a scenario where that was to his detriment, where being president actually worked against it? And so I latched onto that for this book and said, I really want to envision a scenario where everything that is normally advantageous to Jack Ryan Jr., including his name, works against him. And so he's on the run. He doesn't have help. It's focused solely on him. And so that's what Target Acquired is. And so Target Acquired is set in Tel Aviv, Israel, and Israel in general. And Tel Aviv is one of my favorite cities in the world. I've had the great fortune over the last 8 or 9 years to work with a number of Israeli companies and have a number of Israelis as friends and have been there many times. And so I said, what if we set this in Tel Aviv and have Jack Ryan Jr. is doing something that seems very innocuous at first. He's filling in for Ding Chavez and running this asset validation exercise when he sees this young woman with her child. And so the mother and the child are just kind of doing their own things. And then Jack looks behind her and there's a man with a knife who's moving to interdict her. And so that launches Jack into, the plot of the book, in which he has to determine who's hunting the woman and why before she inadvertently unleashes the apocalypse. So very small stakes, nothing that could really go wrong here other than the world potentially ending. So
why not?
Kind of Target Acquired.
Why not? Keep it easy.
Exactly.
It's funny. Now, you've lived several interesting lifetimes. You have a military background. You were an Apache helicopter pilot for a time. You were an FBI agent, special agent in the FBI, affiliated with a SWAT team. I mean, you've got a lot behind you. And, the Tom Clancy books, he didn't invent the spy book, but he did kind of invent this military techno thriller. And I'm assuming that your life experiences are extremely helpful in working through this type of a book.
Yeah, they are. And you're giving me a little bit too much credit. My wife, I've been married for 23 years and she and I were high school sweethearts. So she has known me since forever. And what she will tell people is I could never figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. And so there's certainly some truth there and into my career choices. But, when the first book in my Matt Drake series came out, it was called Without Sanction. And I was doing an interview for that. The radio interviewer asked me, much kind of the same way that you're going. She's like, man, you have this crazy background. Are you Matt Drake? And I'm like, I am absolutely not Matt Drake any more than I am Jack Ryan Jr., but I have stood in the same room with men who could be. And that, I think, was more than anything is when I was an FBI agent, my job was to run and recruit what we call sources and what folks in the intelligence community call assets. And because of that, I got to rub shoulders with some very interesting people and folks from different agencies. And so you're constantly pulling all of that into the book that you're writing, and you want to use the background and the stuff that you have done to add a veracity to it. But at the end of the day, your job is to tell a compelling story. You're not writing nonfiction. You're not writing a police or a procedural on how to do counterespionage. You're writing a good story. And I think sometimes it may be that folks with backgrounds like mine, or even more interesting backgrounds, those can be a blind spot. Because if you remember, Tom Clancy, I heard someone else termed him as an insurance salesman with a library card. And that was really all his expertise was. Or you look today at some of the best-selling authors, Daniel Silva or Brad Thor or Vince Flynn and now Kyle Mills. None of those folks ever served in any capacity that they write about, but they tell compelling stories and they get the details right. And so I think the bargain that Tom Clancy made with readers that he did so well is Tom Clancy, will do the research so that when you read my book, you will believe that I know something about the satellite system I'm describing, the weapon, the platform, but I'm going to tell you an incredible story that will stretch the bounds of reality, and you're going to go with that because I've done my homework up front and I'm telling you this great story. And that's the contract that I try and keep with my writing as well.
Exactly. And it touches on a point that I question, and that is that a lot of the people coming into the Tom Clancy universe, you've got at least two types of readers. You've got those who are really engrossed and want to immerse themselves in the tech side of things. And then you've got somebody who really wants to just read the story for the thriller aspect of it. So as an author, it's probably difficult, and in particular for an author like you with the background that you have and the innate knowledge that you have, to kind of strike that balance so that you don't lose either section of those readers. I mean, you want to keep
Absolutely.
the techno people interested, and you don't want to lose the casual reader. So how do you do that? How do you balance it so well?
I think the first thing you have to do, and my editor was really great with this, when he gave me the opportunity to write in the Clancy universe, and we had our first sit down where I'd said yes and we'd figured it out. He's like, look, there's only one Tom Clancy. There's only one, and he's not around anymore. He's passed on. I am not bringing you on to write like Tom Clancy, to try and be Tom Clancy, to do anything. I'm bringing you on because I love your Matt Drake series, and I want you to write the way you write, but write it in his universe. And so the reason why that was important in several different manners is there's one of them, and I believe it is The Sum of All Fears, which has the nuclear weapon threat to it. And so in that book, there's a section where Tom Clancy literally takes you as an electron that's going through the firing mechanism of the bomb. And somehow he is able to make that interesting. I could never do that. Most people are never going to be able to do that. And so you have to resist the urge to write like him or to try and bring that much technical detail, because frankly, most of us mere mortals are going to ruin the story doing that. We're going to bring down the pacing. We're going to take people out of it. And so what I try and do is bring enough. It's almost like the same thing like when you're writing descriptions, right? You want to avoid writing a travel book, but you want to have enough there that there are lodestones or kind of points of reference that somebody can latch onto and say, I now know what that feels like to walk down the street in Tel Aviv, right? I've given you enough of that you believe it's real, but I'm not overwhelming you to death with the level of detail. And I feel like to walk that line from a technical perspective, it's the same thing. And there are times where I have to dial it back because, again, my job was to run and recruit sources, and I could go too far down into, the espionage lexicon or this brush pass or something like that. And that seems really cool to me. But then when you look at it in the second draft or third draft, you're like, you're sacrificing pacing for a story for detail that you like because you want to show how much you know about the topic that really isn't important for the story. And so at the end of the day, I think just like any other book, what you have to keep in mind is story trumps everything. Story is king, and pacing is what drives the story and makes a reader turn from one page to the next. And so anything that you do to sacrifice that, even if it's putting in the coolest detail about, doing a brush pass or what this 3-letter agency does, if you're sacrificing story or pacing, you got to take it out.
Another part of this challenge to you coming into the Clancy universe, you've got the technical side, you're a good author, but you're coming in and you're writing characters that were created, not only created by Tom Clancy, but have been built upon by, in the Jack Ryan Jr. series, at least 3 other authors. So you've got that challenge of adding your own to what they've already done. So does it become more difficult as a writer to work in someone else's universe as opposed to when you're writing the Matt Drake series, it's all you? And how do you address that challenge?
It's absolutely more difficult. And thankfully there's a couple of guardrails, if you will. And so one being Tom Colgan, the editor. He was Tom Clancy's editor before Tom Clancy passed on, and has helmed the series ever since. And so there are times where, so for instance, there's a scene in Target Acquired in which Jack Ryan Jr. is calling back to talk to John Clark. And John Clark is, next to Jack Ryan Sr., probably the most iconic character in the Clancy franchise. His origin story was the book Without Remorse, which is still one of the most, if not the most popular Clancy book.
Fabulous book. Absolutely fabulous book.
Incredible. And so the amount of weight that he brings to a scene every time he's in it is daunting. And so there's a scene where he's talking to him, and the first variant of that scene, or the variant that Tom said, Jack Ryan Jr. may have been a little bit snippier than what the occasion warranted with John Clark. And so Tom Colgan, being the good editor he is, came down on that like thunder from heaven, smiting me and saying, that is not how Jack Ryan Jr. would talk to John Clark. And he's like, that's Matt Drake, your other character that slipped in here. And it was, and he was right. And so I had to think about that and so he very much serves as the guardrail, both from a plot perspective to how individual characters and stuff interact. The second part is I'm lucky enough to be friends with Mark Graney, who did, like I said, the original, some of the books with Tom, and then the original ones after Tom died. And so I got to call up Mark Graney and pick his mind about Jack Ryan Jr. Who is he? What makes him tick? Who do you picture when you think of Jack? Why did he do those things? And so I had all of that. But then at the end of the day, you still have to write the character. And it's very, very intimidating. And so part of the way I skirted around that, or I didn't skirt around it, the way I wanted to address it is, like I said before, to neck down that book so that it was focused almost exclusively on Jack Ryan Jr. so I could devote the entire thing of climbing into his head and figuring out what makes him tick and why he interacts. And there were some interesting things that I thought about as part of that. One of them being, and this theme is kind of raised in the book, that most boys grow up in the shadow of their fathers, right? When you're 5 or 6 or 7, you think your dad's Superman. When you're 16 or 17, you're convinced he's lost his mind. When you're 20 or 21, he's suddenly smart again. But there's usually at some point in there, right, where you love and respect your father, but realize that he's just a man. He's just a mortal. And maybe sometimes you might even eclipse what your father's accomplished. Jack Ryan Jr. is never going to be able to do that, right? He is father to this iconic, the definition of the warrior statesman. And knowing that he's only where he is originally because he happens to be related to this man. And so how do you deal with that? How do you figure out, am I just doing this because this is what dad did? Am I trying to live up to what dad did? And not just that, but then you start reflecting, as I think all men do at some point, is here's where I am in my life right now. And here's what I've accomplished. And where was my father when he was my same age? What did he do? And so kind of answering those questions and probing them a little more really gave me the opportunity to dig into what Jack Ryan Jr., what made him tick, and helped me kind of bridge that gap that you were talking about.
It's an interesting, I love the book, and
Thank you.
Recommending it to all of our readers here at the library. How is Jack Ryan different? And you've alluded to Matt Drake earlier.
Yeah.
How do they compare and contrast? Because I honest with you, I haven't read any of the Matt Drake books yet.
No worries.
I'm going down the hall later today, and I'll pull them out.
Great. I'd love to hear what you think. So, it took me a while, as I think we talked about, to get published and to figure out what I was doing and what somebody, I think maybe it was Nick Petrie, who writes the Drifter series with Peter Ash. He's a fantastic writer too, said that, when you come to a genre, you want to do something same but different. And so same in that if you're writing a military thriller, your book belongs on the shelf next to Mark Graney or Brad Taylor or something, but different in that Brad Taylor already writes a phenomenal Brad Taylor book. You don't need to write another one. You got to be you. And so one of the big influences on me was Nelson Demille, and particularly Nelson DeMille's John Corey series. And so he writes this incredibly witty, funny New York police detective who, I remember when I finished Plum Island, the first book in that series, I told my wife, I'm like, I would go to the gas station with John Corey just to hear what he's going to say next.
Right.
And at the time, there weren't very many folks in the thriller community who were writing at that first person voice. And so Matt Drake, from a writing perspective, I write in first person. He's very witty, has that dry kind of self-depreciating sense of humor, and is somebody who where Jack Ryan Jr. operates on the fringe for a shadow organization. Matt Drake is a former member of the Ranger Regiment, because I was lucky enough to work with 5 folks who all came from the Ranger Regiment and Special Operations background. So he brings that military side kind of like I do. And then he works as a person whose job it is to run and recruit sources. And so while he certainly gets into his share of trouble, it's much more of a conventional, if you will. You say, yeah, I can see where he belongs in this scope, where Jack Ryan Jr. is somebody who, like I said before, didn't have that background to fall back on. And so there's kind of a joke if you're an infantry officer and you walk in the room, the first thing another infantry officer does is say, do you have a Ranger tab on your shoulder? Because that, and I think I actually did the wrong shoulder, because that shows that you have been and mastered a course that is incredibly hard, but is seen as a fundamental for everyone in that particular field of service. Matt Drake has that. Jack Ryan Jr. doesn't. And so every time he bumps up against John Clark, who's a SEAL, Ding Chavez, he was an infantryman, one of the other characters who was a former Delta Force operator, in the back of his mind, he's thinking, I got to prove myself that I belong here, that I have what it takes to do what this case officer who's CIA trained. And so they certainly operate in the same space and belong in the same thriller universe together, but they're very, very different characters.
Where are you headed from here? More Jack Ryan Jr. or back to Matt Drake?
So I am fortunate enough to be able to write 2 series at the same time. So I turned in Target Acquired to my editor in February, and obviously it just came out. And then I frantically jumped into my 3rd Matt Drake book, which is called Hostile Intent, and that is due in about a month on the 15th of July. And then it'll be back to hopefully back to Jack Ryan Jr. again. So crazy schedule, but writing in the Tom Clancy universe, the only thing I can compare it to that's more pop culture or more iconic is if you were a screenplay writer and somebody tapped you on the shoulder and said, do you want to write the next Star Wars movie? Like, as a writer, it's one of those things, especially in this genre, that you dream about. And the first time I ever sat down on my computer and typed Jack Ryan, and I'm like, holy crap, like, I am writing this guy now. And it's still, I feel like I got to pinch myself sometimes.
Yeah, just a question. And when you're thinking about, okay, this book's going to come out and it's going to have Tom Clancy's name and my name on the cover, you get a little chill down the spine, or a little bit of dread.
Both. When somebody asked me, what was your gut reaction when you learned you were going to get to write for Tom Clancy? And I'm like, I didn't know it was possible at the time to have like goosebumps and want to vomit at the same time, because you're like, this is so cool, and now I got to do it, and where's the trash can over here? So absolutely. I mean, my editor was super amazing in that for my launch for Without Sanction, my first Matt Drake book, when that came out, I had just learned that I was going to get to write Tom Clancy. And so to my book launch, he had the cover team design up a mock Tom Clancy book with his name and my name on it, just so that somebody could give it to me at my book launch, which was an incredibly cool thing to do. And I just remember staring at his name and my name, his name, and I'm like, how in the world did I get there? Like, how in the world is this my life that my name gets to appear on a book next to his? It's incredible.
It's a wonderful thing. The book is great. The book is Target Acquired. Come down to the library, pick it up. It is published by Putnam, and the author is Don Bentley. And Don, we're looking forward to next. As I said, I'm going to run down the hall and pull the Matt Drake books and get into that series. I look forward to it. Thanks so much for spending some time with us today. I know you got a busy schedule. We appreciate it, and we'll talk to you down the road.
Thank you so much, Barney. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks a million. And that will do it for this chapter of Turn the Page, and we'll see all of you next time. Thanks a lot.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.